welcome all to GCAS. We are excited about today's event here in central Toronto. We have two great guests for us today, and I'd like to introduce them to you. But before I do, I just want to let you know, I want to thank you for your support of GCAS, the first model in the history of higher education where faculty and even graduates, we own the college together. We're now accredited in the European Union, and we have a lot more things going on, too many to say now. But this happens to be the 10th country that we've held a live seminar in. We've been in Cuba, Slovenia, Athens, Greece, Ireland, all over the world, down in Bogota recently. And so it's really exciting to do GCAS that's both online, but also in person. We're trying to materialize our existence post-COVID in the safest way possible. And I'd like to introduce our guests now for our conversation today, having to do with media, advocacy at the local organizational level, and also, of course, the events of the war that's happening now in Ukraine. So we're going to talk about those things and probably a lot more. But let me introduce our guests. First guest is Diana Chan McNally, who has two master's degrees. One is in adult education and community development, and the second one is in museum curation, museum work. And so not only does she have two master's degrees, she's frequently on local television where she speaks about advocating for homelessness, especially, and other issues that emerge in the city here in Toronto. And in addition to those things, she is also a pretty famous artist. She's a DJ artist. She's a DJ, and she specializes in Italian disco, which I hope she will do for us a little bit today. Probably not, because we're going out for sushi after this. You're all welcome. Our next guest is Professor Henry Warwick. Professor Henry Warwick is a professor of media studies here and has been for a while here in Toronto and is a leading voice in media studies. He did his PhD in European Graduate School. Some of you are familiar with that, EGS. And he is also really interestingly, he was one of the premier artists who started doing electronic music back in the mid 80s. And in the 90s got into software development and was even part of Napster. Do you remember Napster? It was glorious. You could go on the internet. For all you Gen Zs out there, you could actually go on the internet and download any music you wanted to. And so our Professor Warwick here was part of that development. Maybe you could talk about that later, but that's exciting. That's really interesting. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests. Welcome. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Nice to meet
Welcome
you.
to all the people out there in TV land.
Yes. Hello.
So we're here. I'm really excited to be able to talk with you today, and of course with Diana, whom I haven't seen in years because of the plague.
Yep.
So this has just been really wonderful.
Yeah. An odd social event, but hopefully a very good, perhaps also odd, pedantic conversation. So.
Well, it's all good.
I'll keep forward to that.
So yeah, I think one of the things that has been going on since we started talking about and thinking about this was the realities of the invasion of Ukraine and how it's not just out of the blue. There's reasons why Putin acted so foolishly, but I'm not interested in going into that myself. I mean, I don't think that's relevant. What I find more interesting is there's other kinds of warfare that exist, and this is all occurs in a hyper-mediated situation. For instance, what Diana works with is basically warfare. It's just not with guns all the time.
Sometimes.
Sometimes it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, as someone who is frequently talking to the media and obviously talking, if you're familiar with my work, talking a lot about sort of a paramilitary approach to unhoused people, kind of enacting this austerity agenda. It's really interesting to me to draw parallels between kind of the narratives that we're seeing when folks are talking about Ukraine, when the media is discussing this, even versus warfare in other countries, and how that relates to the narratives that are being purported here locally in Toronto and in Ottawa recently with the convoy protests. So
Yeah.
not going to get into the history so much.
Yeah, well,
I'll leave that to others.
Because we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
We could spend hours just unpacking all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's all that useful or interesting, but I agree. And the kind of warfare, it's also class warfare.
Yeah.
And it's in its most blatant form.
Yeah.
And that's not to be underestimated, not only because it's just bad, but it results in enormous amounts of suffering. And that's where I think the media comes in really big time. That's a technical term.
Big time?
Big time.
Yeah. Let's unpack that term.
Exactly. Let us unpack. What I was thinking is it creates all of the kind of propaganda spheres and spaces that allow people to rationalize various things. And that's what's exactly going on in the war with Ukraine. So there's been this consistent war against information by both sides.
Yeah.
And that's another thing is that, see, I'm not really a dialectician. I'm really not into that. I don't think that it's ever a question of opposites. I believe in multiplicities. Mm-hmm. And so.
Which is not how most of the media operates and not how people generally think.
Exactly. And well, no, thank you. And that's, you summed that well, because that's the whole point is, so the media finds it easy to reduce things to polarities. Mm-hmm. And so, Russia bad, Ukraine good, and these kinds of problems. And then you can see this turned on the homeless, where, homeless can be portrayed as bad because they're cluttering my streets. Yep. And then it's also homeless as good in the face of heartless, real estate situations. Mm-hmm. So the media to me is kind of like central nexus for all of this, because as we were talking about Baudrillard earlier, his whole thing about, the first Iraq war never happened because it existed as a media object. Mm-hmm. We're seeing that also with Ukraine, but not quite to the same extent because of the level of destruction and the location of the destruction, which is basically in Europe's backyard. And then you flip it to the street and it's still ugly. There's still this mass discrepancy between what is actually going on and then how it's portrayed in the media.
Absolutely. And it also kind of points to, who's actually involved in these conflicts. And you look at the situation in Ukraine and, obviously there's been a lot of discourse around, especially within Canada, how we're looking at people who look like us, essentially, which isn't fully true. I'm someone who is a racialized person, but when you kind of see the narrative that's being spun around a place like Ukraine, people taking up arms in that context because we identify with the people of Ukraine, they're not labeled insurgents, but they would be elsewhere. If we were looking at racialized people, they probably would be labeled as such. So there's an element there too of upholding white supremacy within these narratives.
Yep.
And when we're looking at how homelessness is treated, and we look at how refugees in this context are being referred to and spun versus, say, people locally who are experiencing homelessness and fighting for housing, there is a huge divide, even though the situation is ultimately, these are people who have nowhere to go, right? But one is ultimately attacking capitalism, essentially, because we financialized housing to the extent that we have. And so this is ultimately a bad thing. And we're going to frame people who are doing this and who aren't pulling up their invisible bootstraps that don't exist as being problematic within our society, but we're going to herald and aggrandize refugees, which there's nothing wrong with that, but dignity should exist for everybody within that situation. And what we're seeing is absolutely not that. So there is that complete narrative divide, I think, that's occurring.
I agree. And I think that's one of the reasons why, excuse me, the situation in Ukraine has jumped so quickly into everybody's, not everybody, but I should say, the Euro-American front center thing of their immediate consciousness because of this kind of inherent, institutional racism built into the media narrative. And I completely agree with that. Horrible things have been going on all over the place, and they still are. I mean, just talk about Somalia and Yemen. And yeah, you hear about things periodically in Yemen or any of these other hotspots, and millions of people die. But it's not. We're not shutting down Saudi Arabia's access to SWIFT, like that. And so so there's that, and then the same thing as you pointed out with on the street. I'll be flipping through Facebook and Blog TO will say, "Wow, look at this little shack on the east end of Scarberia. It's going for $1 million."
This is not a great housing situation. It's garbage housing, quite frankly. But like
Toronto in general, or
Toronto is in bad shape.
Yes, extremely.
what are the causes of bad housing situation?
That's a really huge one.
I mean, I can
want to go
unpack
first?
that. Sure. I mean, if we want to kind of go back historically, we did have a national housing program in Canada that was discontinued in the 1990s by the Liberal government. We have a Liberal government now with Justin Trudeau. So this was essentially defunded, and then it was foisted upon the provinces to take on the responsibility for housing, which never materialized. We've had no investments at any level of government that are even adequate enough to meet the need. And we also have a market that is predicated on the financialization of land to such an extent that it would be hugely damaging to the economy if that weren't the case. So there hasn't been a real onus by the federal government, by any level of government, to shift that, simply because we are dependent on it. And what we're seeing is that a city like Toronto is so advanced. And it's not gentrification. It's such an oversimplification of what's going on here. We're really talking about money at a grand scale that we can't even really fathom.
Yeah, there's been a lot of money parking by foreign interests. They'll just buy several floors of a condo building and just sit on it.
Without anybody occupying.
That's often, oddly, people have been occupying the spaces more, but there's still a lot of empty space.
There's a lot. I mean, if you want to kind of boil it down, we are creating housing without the intention of actually putting anyone into it. We're extracting the financial value of it.
Does that like artificially move the market up because of that? Because it creates more of a demand.
Yeah.
I see. That's pretty
evil.
Yeah. And we have a minimum wage in Ontario, so our province here in Canada, of $15 an hour. And we have an average market rent for one bedroom that is over $1,700. So when we talk about the cost of living in this city, it's no wonder that we have this gross situation of homelessness that's occurring. But we're also often a country that talks about, like in terms of our foreign policy, we are a helping country. Refugees are welcome here. Well, most refugees who come here end up unhoused. They end up in the shelter system. They end up not being able to actually afford the housing that's here. So we exacerbate homelessness and absolutely enact, in my opinion, like a very racist agenda against people who are coming here because they have no other choice, but they end up in the shelters and they're not given support financially in terms of the trauma. In fact, we compound their trauma by putting them into these systems, by forcing them onto social assistance, which is grossly inadequate. $733 a month. How do you live off of that? We're talking Canadian. We're not talking about euros, which are more than double.
Yeah, well, I think, 733 Canadian is about maybe 600 and change American.
Yeah.
So it's like
it's
nothing.
negligible. negligible, and people have to retrain. There again, in our education system, we have a very racist agenda where international students or students who are not English speaking encounter additional barriers, including the cost of going to school is triple. So, you know, you put people into this situation and essentially like you're taking people who are grossly traumatized and furthering that. And in many cases, I've worked with lots of people frontline who never recovered from that.
Wow.
Yeah.
And they end up unhoused long term, but we stop calling them refugees.
And the other thing is the tightness of the housing market, which is also seen in the United States for different reasons. But you have this problem, which is also in the United States, where zoning is a huge issue. So that's why you end up in North America, you have like towers and suburbs. There's nothing in between.
Yes.
So this is all impelled by the housing development laws. It's written into law. You cannot have a street that is narrow with 5-story buildings and multiple doors going in and out with, you know, with corner shops and stuff. That's just, you literally can't, it's illegal. It's illegal to build like that. And that's all over North America. It's not just here, it's in the United States too. That's why you get these giant, what are called stroads. They're like street roads, 6 lanes of traffic. Nobody's paying attention because they're all on the phone. So you get all these fender benders. It's a mess. It's a disaster. Another aspect of this is, in speaking of which, in Toronto, they changed the bylaw, I think back in the 90s. You cannot build a house with 2 front doors.
Okay.
Because it's aesthetically unappealing.
Yeah, that neighborhood character is often used as an excuse to further
See, exactly,
Yeah.
the agenda of
Really-
single family homeowners. And
Yeah.
I live in a single family home, but that's just because we landed there. I mean, we
Yeah.
lucked out, but my neighbors live in a duplex. There's an apartment building next door to me that has, it's not an apartment, it's a house that was cut up, but it has 2 front doors because this all happened back in the 60s.
Yeah.
You see? So, but you can't build a house like that now.
Well, one of the things I love when I visit cities around the world is visiting different ethnic places or zones. And I noticed in Toronto, they have, there's the Jamaican neighborhood just on Eglinton here on the west side. The Greek neighborhood, of course. You know, when I'm in New York, you have the same kinds of things. And that's what makes a city just so rich and beautiful because, hey, let's get some Thai. And you go to the Thai
neighborhood, yeah, sure.
neighborhood or Chinese or, you know, whatever. And, but I understand, I was talking to somebody from Jamaica who was moved out of that Jamaican side. And you can confirm this with me because unlike other ethnic groups like the Greek neighborhood, for example, they bought the land under it and are putting up condos and basically just taking the Jamaican, vibrant neighborhood that's been here for 40, 50 years and just basically it's dissolving. Is that right? Is that the way this?
Yeah, there's been very little movement in terms of local policy, municipal policy to actually protect the fact that people are low income in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so they are being pushed out. And we've been seeing this across the city for quite some time. There's another neighborhood, Regent Park, which was kind of a landing space for a lot of racialized folks, a lot of immigrants. And that has essentially been razed entirely. So there was a lot of public housing built during the 60s, not maintained, but still, people's homes. And now a lot of them are living well outside the city because they can't afford to stay here.
Mhm.
So, a lot comes with that. It's not just you're no longer in your neighborhood. What's the public transportation like out there? What are the opportunities? Where can you actually socialize and build community with people? And I'm from the suburbs. There's not a lot of spaces that are really accessible for people who are poor.
Exactly. And when I was talking about the kinds of bylaws about what you can or cannot build.
Yeah.
Prime example is Berlin. I have a friend who lives in the Prenzlauer area, Prenzlauer, and that whole area was completely pulverized in World War II. There was not a single building standing. It was just flat because it's Mitte. It's like downtown, right? It's totally destroyed. You go there now, well, gee, it looks like a European city. You got like endless blocks of 5 and 6 story tall buildings in these blocks that have shops and cafes and these, there's this semi-permeable membrane of flow between the inside and the outside. It's a great neighborhood. I'd love to live there. Everybody does, and you had the same thing here. Like even like this neighborhood before all the towers came up, you had like, low rise buildings and lots of them. And now it's all condos. Why? Because that's the only way you can build, because of the laws about how housing can be built.
So who sets the laws? Are the
local city administrations, and they're all usually bought off by the real estate lobbyists?
Well, we have sort of these laws around density as well. So there are only certain sections of the city which are approved for higher density. So you start to see a lot of very high rises in particular areas and residential areas that have a tendency more towards single family homes that never encroaches, even mid-rise. It's seen as an affront, a dissolution of neighborhood character, and yet you completely ruin these thoroughfares. Liberty Village.
And let's say Putin goes all out and he turns Kiev into some version of Aleppo, right? And when they rebuild Kiev, do you think they're going to rebuild it like this? Hell no. They're going to do the same thing. They're going to build 5, 6 story mid-rise buildings, but they're going to rebuild it in a European sense, because they have the infrastructure underneath the ground, the subways and all this. It's built to be like a European city, not like this kind of deal.
Posit this is like a cancer in a weird way.
Oh yeah.
There's no logic to any of it. It's just wherever you can extract the most value, this is what we're going to do. I find the city in particular, and I've spent a lot of time in Europe playing records and lots of different cities there. And what I find specific about Toronto is that we have this kind of amnesiac sort of situation here where people don't remember or know anything about the city that happened even 10 years ago. I often talk about the history of Toronto and the history of poverty, and that's completely invisibilized. And here we're so caught up with being this world-class city that we're always pushing for the new without recognizing the benefits that already exist here. And then we just eradicate them.
Well, I have a question for you. You're a DJ, an artist, music artist. How does someone who gets into that, first of all, how did you get into it? And then secondly, how does that relate at all to your community organizing and adult education? I'm really curious. And would you mind repeating the question just in case the mic didn't pick up my voice?
So how did I get into DJing, and how does that fit into my work as a community worker and as an educator? I'm not sure it does, to be perfectly honest. I got into it years ago. There was a fellow, an artist in Toronto who unfortunately passed away from brain cancer quite young. But he kind of introduced me to Italo disco at his party. His name was Will Monroe, just like a lovely, very community oriented person. And from there, got into it and haven't stopped, and collect a lot of vinyl records, which I recognize as odd for most people, let alone a youngish woman. But how does that fit in? I don't know. It's a bit of a respite from the difficulty, I think, of my work otherwise, because the battle is so uphill. You need to find joy wherever you can, and so it brings me joy. So if it fits in anywhere, it's to offset how horrific this world is, because it's on fire. That's how I feel about it.
Sometimes the music can be a way to release maybe the anxieties that come with, and the emotional drain that comes with doing the kind of advocacy you do.
Yeah, and music is very much a communal experience, for me at least. I've thrown parties in the past for some of my coworkers, or I threw a fundraiser for an overdose prevention site because they were defunded by the government, just as a way to bring people together and essentially let off some steam. So, you know, there is that intersection too, but it's a bit left field, maybe.
Yeah. My own work is kind of like integrated into my whole socio-political aesthetic. I'm a bit of a commie, so I give everything away. The only record I charge for is one that I did with Robin Story from Rapun, and he was also in Soviet France.
Mm.
And and all that money goes to Brunswick House.
Oh, okay.
So anything I make from there, I send a check into those guys. And so that's how that works. Everything I do is digital because I have absolutely no faith that any of this civilization will be remembered. So there's no point. You know, why try to get into the whole fame game? It's a meaningless effort. So I just don't want to do that.
Very interesting. I think it's really interesting that you give all your work away. It's very unusual for an academic, let alone an artist.
Thank you for saying that, because this feeds directly into something that's core that I find wonderful and privileging, and it just pisses me right the fuck off at the same time. Oop, dropped an F-bomb. It's okay. Okay, fine. We're good to go. So I'll just to make the math easier, pretend I make 100,000 a year. Okay, 100,000 a year. My contract says it's 60% teaching, 20% service, and 20% research and scholarship. Okay, so that means technically I get paid $20,000 a year to make music, because that's my research. Tell me one avant-garde, abstract noise maker like me who does ambient, space out, nostalgia, terror music, who makes 20,000 a year off their music. The answer is almost none. It's like maybe the Boards of Canada. That's about it. And Brian Eno and a handful of others. But other than that, everybody's like, looking for work.
Yeah, fair enough.
I literally have a job that pays me 20 grand theoretically, like 20% of my wages are there to pay me to do my work. I put out 9 albums in the past 3 years because I can.
Yeah. No, but I mean, you have a great situation for that reason. But, in terms of, as an academic, if you're not monetizing your image, as a musician, if you're not, but you're saying you don't care about the fame. And that in itself is really interesting, because I don't know anyone else personally who has that kind of perspective and acts that way as both an academic and an artist.
Wow. Well, thank you. I take that as a compliment.
Good.
It's true though, because I just look at it like when this all started back in I've been doing electronic music since like high school back in the 70s. And
oh wow, so that was early days.
Yeah, but it was all like music concrete, tape effect stuff. So I just cut tape and make crazy noises with it. My first synthesizer was in art school in Boston. I went there for like a semester and a half and then ran out of money. That's a long story. So I started learning about more advanced techniques there. And then I went to Rutgers and got my bachelor's degree there and worked with the people there. They had a bunch of gear. And then I got married and moved to DC for 9 long years, but that's a different issue. But when I was in DC, I got divorced and then met this woman and she said, Henry, let's buy a house. And I'm like, sure. And I'm like, she's like, so what's your credit rating? And I'm like, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, what's a credit rating? And she says, oh, we're in trouble. And I'm like, so how do I get a credit rating? She says, well, take out a loan and pay it back. Not a little loan, like a substantial loan, and pay it back. And I'm like, cool. So how much? And she says, $5 grand would be a good idea. And back in like the late 80s, $5,000 was a fairly
That's
big loan.
significant, yeah.
So I didn't need a car because I had a great car, 672 Nova. Yeah.
GTO.
This thing was a monster. It was terrifying. But anyway, so I figured I'd build what I always wanted, an electronic music studio. So I bought an Atari computer and a Korg sampler and Yamaha synthesizers and software, and I was off to the races.
Yeah.
And so that's how I started that. So I did my first few albums in DC off of that setup. And then I moved to San Francisco and my sound changed a great deal. And then I stopped making music for a while and did mostly paintings. And I need to go collect them. And that's going to be a horror, but that's a different discussion. And then I got back into music in the late 1990s. And I've been doing it consistently ever since. And yeah, so that's how I got into it. And I knew from the start I was never going to make a living off of this, because like, who's going to spend money on something that goes for half an hour into an
I
echo?
know a couple people, but yeah,
Yeah,
fair.
but you know
fair,
what I mean. You're not going to pay the rent that way.
No.
So I realized a long time ago that I needed good day jobs.
Yeah.
Is that how you got into academia?
Well, kind of, yeah. What happened was I got married in San Francisco to Beth. We're still married, happy kids and all that kind of thing. And I was doing graphic design and type design on computer. And then from there, I got a job at Macromedia in their tech support department. And then I went from tech support to quality assurance at Macromedia for this program called KeyGrip. KeyGrip got sold to Apple, and that became Final Cut Pro. So I was on the Final Cut Pro development team
Wow.
for several years. And
Final Cut Pro has to do with like video.
Video
Video
editing.
editing.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, so I did that. And then after that, I got sick of the commute because it was an hour and a half each way. And I was just like,
In San Francisco.
yeah, well, I worked at Apple down in Cupertino.
No.
Yeah, so it was like
Yeah, that's wow.
sitting in 280, you know.
Was it still the Nova?
No. I put the Nova into a guardrail at 80 miles an hour, dodging a deer in Pennsylvania. But
We both have that in common. Deer totaled my car in Pennsylvania.
oh wow,
I don't
Those
drive a
deer in
car.
Pennsylvania, they're dangerous.
and suicidal.
They are. They
It's getting in front of you.
So I schlepped that, and then I said I need something better, closer to home. So the woman who was my boss at Apple for a long time, she became the director of QA at Napster,
Okay.
and so I got into Napster.
QA is quality.
Quality assurance, yeah. And so I was hired to help develop the billing client. Ooh, a billing client for Napster, which is free music. No.
Weird.
The whole thing was built on the theory of crack selling. First, it's free.
Yeah.
Second, it's free.
Yeah.
It's free until you're hooked.
Yeah. And then here it comes.
Then bang. So yeah, so we were giving stuff away for
It's
free.
kind of like YouTube channel. Sorry, YouTube. But it's like,
No, it's
it's free, but then you get all these commercials and then
Yep.
the commercials keep getting longer and more frequent until it basically forces you to get into the premium.
Yep.
So then you're paying $10 a month.
I just get an ad blocker.
Oh, really?
I just
Yeah.
let it slide.
Just
I'll
let
watch
it
your
slide.
terrible ad.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I use the Opera browser. It has a built-in ad block, so I just
Okay.
Whoa,
done.
that's clever. So the Napster, you were at Napster. I remember Napster.
Yeah.
It was like, wow.
Yeah.
It was
P3. This is before the iPod.
Yeah,
56.6K modem waiting 12 hours. That 3 megabyte song.
yeah, with
Good
that
times.
horrible machine sound.
Yeah.
But no, so I was there, and it was not a good place to work. It was not a happy situation. The building was unmarked. I
That
work in
bodes
an
well.
unmarked building.
So how did you end up in Canada then?
Oh, well, at the end, when the whole company got laid off, the feds just shut the place down, basically.
Hmm.
So
But you yourself weren't in any liability issues.
No, but no one else knew that. So I was kind of like blackballed in a way.
Oh.
You know, everybody I know who left there had real issues finding work because no one knew what was going on, right? So for the first few months, it was pretty tough. And then I just said, I was looking at, like, you and I were talking about this on the way in. It's like the CTO, well, the two founders, the Seans, they were 19 years old. I was 42. I mean, like, I'm way too old for this game. So I figured, where can I go where age is almost respected? And that's
Canada?
academia.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I got my MFA from Goddard College, because that's a terminal degree, so I could teach at art schools.
I know
Right.
Goddard. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's pretty radical college.
Yeah, it is. And so I got my MFA there in interdisciplinary art. And right out of that, I got a job at New Jersey City University, tenure track. And then that was
Because
great.
MFA was a terminal degree.
Yeah,
It still is, but
sort
the
of.
pressure's on and on to keep ratcheting up those degrees.
Exactly. So I got that. And then I was accepted at the tenure track, like halfway through the first year there. A month and a half later, the governor cut the budget $250 million.
It wasn't Christie, was it?
No, I forget his name. He had like an Italian name, but I don't remember his name.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, so my job disappeared. The line for my job disappeared. Everything was just like, so I went back to San Francisco, and at this point, Bush had been reelected. I'm just like,
Oh, no.
get me the heck out of here.
So you're from the States originally?
Yeah, from New Jersey, just outside New York,
Wow.
otherwise known as hell.
Oh, I've
Yeah.
been through hell.
Yeah, it was a horrible dump. But but yeah, so I did that and started looking, and a friend of mine said, hey, you know, a friend of ours that we went to grad school with, he's said he's looking for people. He talked to me, but I'm in South Korea. I love it where I am, so I don't care. But you should talk to him. So I emailed, and they said, yeah, apply. So bingo, I applied, and you know, the whole rounds that you go through and the interviews and the demos and all kind of shit. And then suddenly I'm here.
Things are so different. I mean, I'm a contract instructor. And so like the trajectory for people like me at my age is just negligible. I mean, I've interviewed for tenure once. That was clearly to basically pad out their responsibilities of making sure that they at least talk to a couple people before hiring the person that they intended to.
That happens a
It's
lot.
very obvious to me. And yeah, I am a contract instructor. I taught at X University where you teach,
Mhm.
Centennial College and George Brown College locally. And, you know, we know, at least in North America, I cannot speak to the EU at all, but we know that about 60% of your teaching staff are people like me who make $200 a week to teach.
I know.
Of course.
It's horrible.
It's pretty horrible.
You know, I hate it.
actually.
I really hate that.
Well,
I
I
am
mean,
so, it just angers me. I would love the CUPE union, CUPE is the union.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I would love to get rid of the CUPE union, not because I'm anti-union, but because I just don't like adjunct faculty to exist. You should be hired as a full-time professor
Well,
doing this. You know what I'm saying?
oh, I know.
And I
mean,
can understand there's needs for like, oh, somebody's on sabbatical, so we need a temporary person to come in.
Yeah.
That I understand, but when you have 60%, I know in my department it's higher than that. It's like 65 or 70%
right, yeah.
Yeah, adjunct.
is all adjunct, and it's just
Yeah.
like,
The quality levels too go down over time because adjuncts are
Absolutely.
overworked and underpaid.
Absolutely.
So over time, even if you're a great adjunct, great teacher, great communicator and so on, over time, it wears, it grinds you down.
yes.
Soul is ground.
What I'm finding now as well, I mean, they're prioritizing the business aspect of it. I mean, to such a degree that it no longer matters if you're an expert in the course that you're teaching. I've taught 20, 21 courses. I would say I probably should have been teaching maybe 5 at best, to be perfectly honest, and you stay 1 week ahead.
Yeah.
And you make it work. But Yeah, the quality, it's apparent to students as well that they're purchasing, frankly, an inferior product. And I'm using that language because that's how the college posits itself. We're offering this product for sale. You're the consumer. And so they basically treat us like we're interchangeable.
Right.
And every semester.
Lack of respect.
Lack of respect.
And the administration just the way in which I think the flip happened with, universities emerged around faculty. I mean, that's what a college is. College is a collection of people.
Right.
Right. And now it's not about the faculty. It's about, making money, administrating, even nonprofits or hedge funds managers. The top 4 hedge fund managers at Harvard a few years ago made as much as the entire faculty.
That's disturbing.
Right. So universities, you have to be careful what you actually see compared to what it actually is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we can get into that.
Yeah.
I just wanted, maybe we could wrap this up and just think through. I know the time has already gone by.
Oh, geez.
And but I wonder if you all could speak to, I don't know what your hopes are regarding, from climate change to the war to other issues, and maybe your hopes or lack of for a future. I know you were thinking apocalyptically.
Well, that's apocalyptic. Okay, so everybody says, "Oh, it'll collapse, it'll collapse, it'll collapse." No, that's not how it works. We don't rate a collapse. We do not get an apocalypse. Sorry.
Well, we actually are living through one. If you look at the literal definition.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. There's zombies.
But it's not like one afternoon, everything goes to pieces and
Jesus comes back.
Fill in the blank. The balloon goes up, whatever it is.
Exactly.
That just doesn't happen, and it's not going to happen, in my opinion. What I think is going to happen is, like everybody says, "Oh, yeah, but what about the fall of Rome?" Rome didn't fall. Rome was abandoned.
100 years for it.
Yeah.
It was literally abandoned. People just walked away from it. All the money moved to Constantinople. They left it behind for the peasants, and that was just the end of it. So there was no. And so if you look at it over time, you get this problem. Another issue, which is generational amnesia.
Yeah.
Because people forget.
Yeah.
It's like so many people. I'll talk to students. Yeah, my dad worked in a factory, and my mom stayed home and raised 6 kids, and we lived in a tiny little horrible dump of a house next to the turnpike, but we had a house, and we did have a car.
Yeah.
And do that today. You just no way.
There's no possibility.
Exactly. So that's generational amnesia. The generations going over, they forget. They never knew it. Yeah. That's how this will proceed.
Like the boomer generation was the generation that made the most money, had the most economic growth.
Mm-hmm.
Gen X, which I think you and I are in.
No, I'm kind of like tail end boomer. I was born in 58.
I'm Gen X.
I'm the age of tail fins.
But now you have the millennials and then Gen Z, where it's actually going down. That you're not making, you're losing. What is it? You're losing opportunities. You're losing wealth, the ability to access opportunities through wealth management, and it's actually going down.
Oh, absolutely. I am a millennial, and just, and I'll have conversations with my parents, and they understand. Now, it took some time because they thought it was an issue of education. I'm more educated than anyone else in my family. These are decoupled. It's not an upward trajectory just because you happen to have degrees anymore. It's long not been the case. I'll say dollar value. I make the exact same that you made in the 1990s.
Right.
But we're not factoring inflation, the cost of living. And that has nothing to do with me, but there's no opportunities really for.
It's not like you're not working hard enough.
I work 3 jobs. So I'm working. And that's utterly normalized.
What the older generation will say, well, you don't work hard enough, but the opportunities.
Millennials work harder than any previous generation, and we work around the clock. And that is evidence-based. Like, this is not just me saying this as defense. It is a fact.
And you're in debt with college.
Yep.
Right. With university training.
Yeah.
So it's all that. So, but as I said, in terms of futures, I'm not looking at an apocalypse, and I'm not a doomer. In fact, I've publicly gone like into major arguments with major doomer types, like, you know, Guy McPherson and all that crowd.
Oh, right.
You know, he and I got into a public debate, and I was not happy talking with him about that, because he's just insane. But that's a different discussion. The point is that we don't rate it. We don't deserve an apocalypse. Okay, it's like this
The
long
clean slate
it's
is
like this
easy.
Yeah, exactly. That would just be simple. No, it's going to be a long grind, and it's going to be like this bumpy plateau down, you know, it's like up and down, but
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
And I think that that's also an opportunity, though, for us to be able to shift things into a much more sustainable, much more resilient future. And that's where I think that that I really do have hope with people, because and when I mean hope, I don't mean like wish upon a star type stuff. I mean like people who manufacture hope by doing something good and doing it over, and like such as yourself. You inspire me with hope because you work hard, and you're doing it for the good, and you keep doing it, and you're really good at it. So
Thank you.
bingo. It's stuff like that. People who do this and continue to do this to rebuild, or I should say build, a more fair, equitable, and resilient and sustainable society. Because if we don't do that, then
Well, I mean, I'm not going to be overly cynical about this. I think what I'm seeing is someone who, you know, purports to be on the left side. I'm fairly left-wing person. And what,
you're among friends.
okay, well, and yes, I imagine so. I don't think you're tricking me here. I mean, what I see is that we're failing to galvanize more broad popular support for the ideals that we inhabit. And so, you know, when I think about the left and I think about the rhetoric that we are espousing, and so often it is just couched in so much negativity. And if you were on the cusp of being interested politically in what we're trying to achieve, those of us who are doing things, why would you be inspired by that? What do we offer to people tangibly that is hopeful, that is optimistic, that's humane, that's an actual reasonable alternative to what it is that we're seeing every single day? And I would say we're not offering a whole lot. And so, you know, I know more people than not are mindful that we are heading in a terrible direction, and people don't want that to be the case. But what are we doing actively to create something else? And I'm not seeing that at the societal level.
I think this plays into what Timothy Morton talks about. I think that we're in a place of mourning. There's a collective grief going on over the loss.
A lot of people in the denial stage, but yes.
Yeah, exactly. And because I think people are starting to wake up that this, you know, this place is on fire. And
I mean, honestly, for those of us who have been, you know, and we've talked about this, we both experienced being unhoused, if I can say that. And, you know, I do this work all the time. Like, this has been a long standing issue. I think it's just been readily ignored by the majority of people, that there has been these gross inequities that are simmering below their fairly comfortable lifestyle. And now that they're confronted with it, any small affront or change to their comfort level is in itself an affront. And it's
exactly. And the media isn't helping. That's the other, to bring this back to what we were first talking about.
Right.
The media is just not helping at all. And it's like the polarization aspects, also the insistence on accepting all disagreeing arguments as valid.
Yeah.
You know, oh, well, we believe in justice and stuff. Well, let's talk to the neo-Nazi. What do you think? You know, and it's unquestioned. And it's just like that kind of nonsense.
Yeah.
That is, it's just, that doesn't help at all. And the other problem is that as this happens and these kinds of people are platformed, you end up with people separating any kind of trust values with their media. So you end up with what's his name? Well, you end up with two statements of the same coin. One would be, what's his name? Hypernormalization. No, the guy, the guy who made those, he's British, he makes documentaries.
Oh,
Adam Curtis. Yeah, so you have a hypernormalization kind of angle. And on the flip side, you also have people like Mark Fisher talking about capitalist realism. And he pulls from like Jameson and previous thinkers. So that's kind of like the deal. So like with a loss of any possible alternatives, or the previous alternatives, they weren't good alternatives. I mean, the Soviet Union was a shithole, but it did have certain advantages like daycare and women were exactly.
International Women's Day is coming up, and we can owe that to the communists.
Exactly. So there's that, but with the end of the Soviet Union and the declaration of the end of history by Fukuyama, you have a preclusion of possibility, and then you end up with exactly what Fisher talked about with capitalist realism and the slow cancellation of the future. Mm-hmm. And this kind of, and people can see it. And he talked about it with like music, how musical innovation is at a standstill. And that was 10 years ago when he was writing about this. And it's even more evident now because you have people, musicians commenting on that with stuff like vaporwave. And people like Boards of Canada, there's all this nostalgia, the Bellbury Polly, the Ghost Box people. This leads to really innately dark conclusions. And that's, but the thing is that no one wants to go there. So they glide over it. It's like everybody knows that it's all fucked up, but whatever.
Well, nostalgia is that ultimate comfort, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that utopian vision of what never was. Yeah. And it's easy. It's easy to do that. And you're right. Like, I think it's not just, related to music. I could say this for the work that I'm doing as well. There's this lack of imagination to create something different. And I'll say, as someone who's constantly thinking about this, I don't know what that vision looks like. And I'm actually struggling to come up with something.
I've been looking actually at what was here pre-Columbian, like the Confederacy of the various peoples along, the St. Lawrence. Yeah. You had that. You had other confederacies forming trade groups all across North America. You had different ways to organize society, and they were really very, very sustainable. I mean,
if we're living in a country that is still utterly failing on truth and reconciliation, to even purport like this is a model of society, Canada's not ready for that, sadly.
Yeah, I know. Sadly. And it's really,
Canada seems much more progressive than the US. Would you agree, Henry?
No.
It's
just in my
We're better at faking it.
Yeah. We're better at looking that way.
It's more socialized.
That is quickly eroding. I mean, we have, universal healthcare was never universal because it doesn't include vision care, dental care, many different things.
But it's certainly much better. I mean, hell, the Americans are buying prescription drugs from Canada because they can't buy them.
We don't have pharmacare either, though.
Yeah.
So,
I'm just saying, like, old people come up here on buses to get prescription drugs on a pretty frequent basis. So, I'm sure that they're good and bad about both sides, obviously, but
there's the thing is that socialized health, or I should say publicly funded health, socialized is another angle. The fact that the state pays for a large portion of the healthcare system here does not mean that it's more socialist. Okay.
And there are gross inequities. And if we have refugees coming here, they will not be eligible, many of them, to actually access our healthcare system free of charge. And so they will rack up significant debt, especially for women who are pregnant, they have a child. You can't really schedule around that if you're not able to access low barrier clinics that are for people who are undocumented or don't have insurance. You can end up in financial ruin. fairly quickly. So, it isn't universal
Yeah.
by any stretch. I work with unhoused people. They are treated terribly to the point where they don't trust the system. Many people I work with, and I think I was telling you both earlier, almost 30% are unvaccinated because they do not trust the healthcare system at all. So there are harms that are committed within that system. And so we often aggrandize it as, and Canadians are so proud of our universal healthcare system and the realities of how people
It
engage
actually
with it.
works.
If
Yeah.
you're racialized, if you're low income, if you're a
Yeah.
refugee, it's very, very, very different
Yeah.
and quite harmful.
Yeah, it's like that. It's a lot like the United States, only there are more rules and they're ineptly performed. It's kind of like this
Yeah.
weird.
It does seem like there are more rules here.
Oh yeah.
We like our rules.
People are friendly though. You walk around, everybody has a smile on their face.
That is so interesting. I find the opposite because I used to go down to the US every single month because I had a DJ residency down there. And I find that Canadians are polite, but they're not nice.
Oh, interesting.
But I find Americans are just brash, but they're upfront. So
Yeah.
you know what you're getting. And in a weird way, and again, as someone who is racialized, there's always this tension of people hiding things in conversation with you when they're being overly polite. And sometimes you would just prefer the bluntness to just be there.
Wow. Well, thank you. Speaking of bluntness, this has been a fast hour.
Oh my, look at
Has it
that.
been an
And,
hour?
but it's really enjoyable. Both of you have a good dynamic.
Yeah.
It's too bad we couldn't do this like more frequently.
Diana
And have a guest on.
and Henry talks.
And it's been a lovely, I'd like to thank Maria for having us here in our studio right on Eglinton in central Toronto. Is this properly central
No.
Toronto?
This is like the north end of downtown.
North end of downtown.
Midtown.
Yeah,
Midtown.
it's like
Midtown.
midtown. Yeah.
Midtown.
There you go. Well, thank you all for watching and thank you for supporting GCAS. And I really want to thank our guests, Professor Warwick and Diana McNally. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next time. Stay tuned.
Catch you all on the freeway, which is already in progress.
Yeah.